Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us tonight on our CoveTalk. This evening, we are lucky to be joined by Colonel Tom McDermott. Colonel McDermott is the Director of the Chief of the Army's Initiatives Group, and he developed the Army's contribution to the National Defence Strategy 2024, which is what he's here to talk to us about this evening. Sir, thank you very much for joining us on the Cove, and I invite you to address the audience.
Thank you very much indeed. Hey, well, good evening to all those who have tuned in online. It's a great pleasure to talk to you all from the wonderful position that is the Royal Military College in Duntroon. And what I'm here to talk to you about this afternoon, in a really informal sense, is this document, which is the Australian Army's contribution to the National Defence Strategy 2024. My aim this afternoon is actually really simple. It's that by the end of this CoveTalk, you can take away, access this document either in paper copy as we have here or online, and you understand better what it is. This is Army's capstone document, and it really gives you a sense of Army's transformation. So where do I want to start? I want to start in a pretty simple place, which is the environment that we face at the minute. The National Defence Strategy 2024, which hopefully most of you are aware of, makes it really clear that Australia faces the most complex and challenging strategic environment since the Second World War. And it's not difficult to see that as you cast yourself around the world and you cast yourself around the pictures that I've got up on the screen at the minute. So whether it be in Ukraine, whether it be in the Middle East, whether it be in dangerous interactions in the South China Sea, Houthi attacks against shipping in the Red Sea, and then the natural disasters that are incrementally building around Australia, we face a very, very challenging environment, one that we haven't probably seen for a number of generations. We don't necessarily have to be surprised by that. If we look across the arc of history, most global pandemics that have taken place have been followed by a period of significant instability that's come with them. So what we're seeing now isn't necessarily different. It's actually probably a return to normality ever since really the end of the Second World War. The Australian government has responded to that set of challenges in a pretty clear and consistent way. In 2023, as most of you will be aware, a Defence Strategic Review was conducted, and on the basis of the findings of that last year, the government published a National Defence Strategy and an adjoining integrated investment plan that allocated funds to procurement of lines. So that really encapsulates the government's response to the situation we face. There's some pretty profound ideas that sit within that response, and the one I just want to highlight to you now is the idea of a shift from what was a balanced and joint ADF to an integrated and focused force. Now, each of the services and cyber and space has a role to play within that, but the Army's bit of that, the Army's contribution to what they describe as a strategy of denial, which is the centre point of what we're trying to do, is actually really well described. It's described as an Army optimised for littoral operations in our northern land and maritime spaces with landing craft, long-range strike capabilities, and a credible combined arms system. So that really captures in one simple sentence what we've been told to do by government. And the Australian Army is transforming to meet that need. And you only have to look at the activities of Talisman Sabre 25 over the last 2 to 3 weeks to see quite how profound that transformation is being. Now really and that's taken place pretty much over the last 2 years since the publication of the Defence Strategic Review. So whether it be the accelerated delivery of the M1A2 SET V3 tank, whether it be the experimentation that takes place under the RICO and the 1st Armoured Regiment, the early acquisition and bringing into firing capability of NASAMS, and then really particularly the firing of the precision strike missile through a HIMARS system last Friday, the scale and scope of that transformation is taking place. And no one listening to this, and no one across Army should think that they are not touched by the transformation that is taking place across Army. The Chief of Army has been really clear that, as a quote here, there is not a soldier, a team, or a formation in the Australian Army that is untouched as we optimise for littoral manoeuvre and deliver a long-range fire capability. If you want a really significant indication of what that looks like, last Friday, it's pretty fair to say that the Australian Army, for the first time in its history, truly entered the missile age when it fired the first precision strike missile. That's a missile with a 300-kilometre range, and the future increments of that can take it out to 500 and 1,000 kilometres. It's a game-changing set of capabilities. The transformation that Army is undergoing is comprehensive. I'm going to talk through this sort of word salad slide I've thrown up here, but when we sit down and try and describe it across government and across to others, we really focus on what we call the 4 Cs. So we're transforming our concepts, we're transforming our command and control, the way in which we set ourselves up to command ourselves in war. We're talking about transforming our capability and our culture. So every element that wraps around Army at the minute is being transformed for this outcome of the national defence element. But something has to tie that together. You know, if a big idea that sits within Army is continual adaptation, there has to be a capstone concept that draws it all in and aligns that vision. And that is the Australian Army's contribution to the National Defence Strategy. This document here, available in print and online. And what I'm going to do for the next sort of 20 minutes is I'm going to actually walk you through the document, and I'm going to explain to you why it was written as it was. What are we trying to tell you, and every Australian, because it's accessible to anyone, what are we trying to say with each one of those sections? So hopefully this talk through of this document will be helpful. It starts in a pretty important place, which is Commander's intent. Now, the Chief of Army about 18 months ago established 4 strategic priorities for Army, which were trust, readiness, being good stewards of our resources, and telling our story. Now, they had never really been enshrined anywhere in Army's publications until we published this. And this lays out, in simple terms, what those 4 strategic priorities are. And what the Chief's made clear is that they will not change now before the end of his tenure in July next year. So when you read that, you can read what the Chief's seeking, but you can also understand that that is the stable basis of his command guidance over the next year, and it has been his stable basis for the last 18 months. So that's a pretty good place to start, to go and read the Chief's intent, his message to the Australian Army, and his 4 strategic priorities. The next stage of the document tries to take a big step back from Army and look at it in the broadest of possible senses. And it tries to describe the Army in 3 dimensions. And this again is an output of the Chief of Army, who looks at Army and says, I think Army has 3 dimensions. And those dimensions are the Army as a national institution, the Army as a profession, and the Army as a fighting force. And we've tried in this section to break down each one of those to give you a real sense of what we mean when we talk about those 3 things. So the Army is a national institution. The Army is one of the oldest and most trusted and respected institutions in Australia. And it's particularly part of the Australian national story, one that goes back through Federation, all the way through the Boer War, and even further to the protections of the states. So as a national institution, we held obligations. That's not just for now, but it's for the past of that institution, and then also the stewardship of it into the future. The next bit then is refocusing on the Army profession. When we look at the Army profession, it has a reasonably long history, and the history of armies and professions of arms is long-standing. But what we found in the last couple of years is the reflections on the Army profession is it may require work to set ourselves up for the challenges of the future that we face. So we're reinvesting in the Army profession, the foundations that exist within it, Army's jurisdiction in society, Army's expertise in our professional body of knowledge, and then our capacity to self-regulate in the face of the enduring corruption that war offers. So this sets up the stage in this section to refocus on the Army profession that is now going on through review across Army. And then finally, there's a section here on the Army as a fighting force. This speaks to Army's principal purpose, which is to fight and win Australia's wars. That is really simple. And it's not for no reason that the quote from George Mansford, the one that sits in the jungle training wing, about not expecting luxuries in our service, is included inside this section. So when you read this section, you get a sense of the Army as a whole. All 3 dimensions, a national institution, a profession, and a fighting force. The next section then is to read back to ourselves what the National Defence Strategy has told us to do. We are faithfully executing the government's direction in our transformation, and therefore picking that out and laying it out in simple terms is really, really clear. Now, you can go away and read it, and I won't go through it in detail now, but there's a couple of things that we need to really pull out. The first is the ability to deploy and sustain land forces in our primary area of military interest. And that, in simple terms, is the area to our north, inside the Pacific and the Southeast Asian archipelago. The other one I'll pull out is the final one, which is about a combined arms land fighting system that allows us to secure and control strategic land positions in the region. That's probably one of the hardest tasks that we'll be asked to do. But this section reads back exactly what the government's been told to do, has told us to do, and it explains how much of a significant shift that is in the strategic role of the Army. Now, a major part of that is the shift to focusing on the littoral. You'll have heard that, optimising for littoral manoeuvre. Now, when we sat down and we thought about it, that's a pretty challenging term. You know, it's not a term that's normally used in day-to-day conversation. So how do you grapple with it? And the conclusion we came to is we just literally had to lean in and grapple with that term from the outset. So we decided to explain the importance of the littoral. You know, why is it so important to Australia that we, and the Australian Army, that we're able to operate within it, and what does it mean? The littoral is defined actually pretty simply. You know, if you go to the dictionary, the littoral is defined as the part of the country that is near the coast. Okay, that's the simplest term, and that's pretty helpful. But if you want to pull it apart a bit more, it's not just about the beach, it's not just about the bit past the beach, it's all of the elements. It's the beaches, it's the rivers, it's the urban areas, it's the population, it's the airspace, it's the electromagnetic spectrum, and it's even the space above it. So when we start to look at the littoral from military terms, we start to explain it as the area of the sea that can be interacted or influenced from the land, and the area of the land that can be influenced from the sea. Now, if you've got a missile that can fire 500 to 1,000 kilometers, the space of the littoral that you can influence is pretty significant. So the littoral is really important. Okay, it's where 83% of Australians live, it's where all of our trade comes in, it's where all of our submarine cables enter, and it's where the bulk of people live in our region. That is why we're so focused on the littoral. And be really clear, the littoral is now our battlefield. So the littoral is where we will fight, and it's where we will optimize to fight in the coming years. So all of our training, all of our capability development is all influenced by that focus on the littoral in our primary area of military interest. So we know what we've got to do, we know what we're like as a national institution, a professional fighting force, and we're now getting a sense of where we're going to fight. So the next bit we try to look at is what does our culture start to look like? So how do we energize a will to fight amongst ourselves inside that profession? So you've heard the term good soldiering significantly over the years. And what we've sought to do in this document is to give an element of refocus to good soldiering. So rather than good soldiering being a bit esoteric, a bit, you know, sort of fluffy, sat on the side, we've refocused good soldiering into the battlefield. It's about our profession, and it's about the application of lethal force to fight and win Australia's wars. But it speaks therefore about not just being soldiers, it speaks about being good soldiers. That is, being experts at our profession, you know, to get really, really high standards in what we're trying to do. We've then taken what was the contract with Australia, which many of you will know from Kapuk and through the other years, and I was a particular fan of this as a CO, and we've modernised it for the 21st century. We've reframed it as a soldier's oath, and we've taken some slight nudges of it in order to bring it into line with defence's values and the new environment in which we're going to fight. The one that will stand out is we're no longer talking about being experts in close combat, we're now talking about being experts in land combat. Okay, that's because our ranges are suddenly expanding out to the hundreds of kilometers. So therefore we need to be experts broader than close combat and into land combat. But that ties us together. Okay, that is part of our culture, and that is therefore an expression of good soldier. We continue to build that then into Army's culture and an expression of Army's culture. Now all of you will know that defence now has a single set of values, and all of defence is aligned inside, all the ADF is aligned inside those values. And the Chief of Army would say that culture is sometimes left in a very woolly place. We don't talk about culture in a particularly practical sense. We talk about it in a business sense, or we talk about it in an esoteric sense. And so what he sought to do, and what we've articulated inside this document, is a very simple setting, a statement on culture and defence values. And that statement's really important. And it says our culture is how well we translate our values into what we think, say, and do every day. And if we can align what we think, say, and do every day to the articulation of defence values in this document, then Army's going to be on a pretty good path with its culture and its behaviours. That is what underpins our fighting power as an organisation. So that snapshot, which sits right in the middle of the document, about Army's culture and defence values, is hugely important into how we express ourselves in what is the most challenging of environments, the battlefield. So things in the document then start to get a bit more practical. We lay out, particularly for those who don't spend a lot of time around Army, we lay out what Army is. So where do the people come from? You know, who are our soldiers, regulars, reserves, and the lines that sit within it. Really importantly, we also explain not where Army is, but why Army is where it is. So if you take the Australian map and you tip it up a little bit, which is what we tend to do, and you start to look up that archipelago of land, the land bridge, that runs from Tasmania all the way up through Asia and into the central point of Asia, That is the bridge which we look up to as we've laid Army out. So it talks about why the force is arrayed as it is. It talks about special operations on the West Coast. It talks about major divisions on the East Coast. It talks about our aviation capability spread across. So it tries to explain why we've positioned Army where it is and how we're now adjusting it to make sure it's perfectly positioned or as best positioned as we can get it for the future. This section also talks about the Australian Army's recapitalisation of our equipment, all of which is accelerating. So the speed of acceleration of delivery of capability and the refocusing of that capability has been really significant. Now let's not be under any illusions. We continue to sit under significant budgetary pressures and we continue to have to make some very tough decisions about where we prioritise ourselves. But you can see from this the speed of delivery and how we're building those capabilities. Long-range strike, land C4, a combined arms fighting system, battlefield aviation, and particularly littoral manoeuvre, which will be one of the most game-changing capabilities this Army has had since the Second World War. So, we've now laid out where the people are, what our culture looks like, given someone reading this a real sense of what Army is and where it's coming from. We then start to get even more practical, and we start to talk about what is Army's role in the National Defence Strategy and the delivery of the strategy of denial. We often overcomplicate these things, so we've tried to keep the language in this section really simple, because we're trying to explain what Army does, not just to ourselves, but to all Australians. So when my mother, your sister, someone's son sits down and says, why do we have an Army? It explains what the role and the tasks are. So here they are, Army's role, pretty clear cut. We are the integrated forces experts in land combat. That is the thing we do that no one else can do. That is the core of our jurisdiction as a profession in Australian society. No one else is Australia's experts in land combat. And then we have a series of 8 tasks that define down what we are training and preparing the Army to do. Now these are not in priority order, but you read them in order and the sense of priority should sit in that manner. And so there is no mistake that the first of Army's tasks is that we need to be ready to fight wars in the littoral. And that speaks back to our core purpose to fight and win Australia's wars. I won't go through them all now, but you can go and read them and you get a sense of what those tasks are: deter and deny threats, enable projection of the remainder of the integrated force, build partnerships, etc., etc. And then down towards the end, contributing to global rules-based order, and then also the support to states and territories in crisis and disasters in extremis, when it exceeds the states and territories' capacities to do so. So that section tells us what Army does and what our role is. This section, though, starts to get into the ideas around land power. Now, again, if you're not in the Army and you haven't studied land power, that can be pretty complex as concepts. So what we try to do in this section is explain the advantage that land power provides to the integrated force in the 21st century. And we try and keep it pretty simple by saying that there are really 5 advantages that land power provides. So if we prepare the Army well, if we're well equipped, well trained, we have a strong culture, we generate 5 things that are of advantages to the integrated force and the ability of the National Defence Strategy to be achieved. So again, you can go and read them, but I'll go through them really quickly. The first one is our capacity for presence. We're able to be present across the nation and across the region, right? We're able to split into multiple task forces, to place ourselves in the right places in strategic locations, to be present in locations. The second one then, though, is persistence. It's our ability to persist in those locations. It's very difficult to maintain a constant persistence of ships and planes at any stage. Any military struggles to do that. But soldiers can persist and land forces can persist in any weather for a significant period of time if they're well trained, well placed and well resourced. So we can be there for a long time and we can persist. The third advantage is our asymmetry. We have the capacity to grow capabilities that you can apply against enemies' weaknesses, such in a way that they can't respond. And Army is increasingly building its asymmetric capability. The firing of the Prism last Friday is a signature demonstration of that. That is something that can be concealed, hidden, and can be applied against an enemy's weakness without much capacity for them to respond to it. The fourth is versatility. Any Army unit can conduct almost any task if they are prepared to do so. So we have the ability to change and shift very quickly. That's hugely important in a region where the tyranny of distance is one of our greatest challenges. So when we put forces forward, we need them to be able to shift from training to combat operations and back again without having to return to Australia to refit to fight. And then finally is our value. When you wrap that all together, our persistence, our presence, our asymmetry, and our versatility, it provides significant value for the amount of investment it takes to build those forces. So wrap those together into a package, and that is the advantage of the Australian Army's land power in the 21st century. So we're almost there. We operate inside an environment, and you will all have heard the various conversations, the various discussions and debates going on about whether drones are revolutionising warfare, whether warfare is changing and the nature of warfare is changing. And we felt it was really important that the Army lays out its stall inside that debate. So we put together a section that talks about the nature of war and the changing character of warfare. Now, what the Army believes is that war's nature endures. So there are certain things about warfare that do not change. It's a human activity, and it's going to remain a human activity for the foreseeable future. It's inherently violent. It's inherently unpredictable. So there are certain things that do not change, and we don't see them changing in the future. And that talks about how we have to generate people to fight. But if war's nature is enduring, its character constantly changes. And therefore what we would agree is that the character of warfare is changing, and it's probably changing at a rate that is faster than it has ever changed before. We reckon there are 6 factors of that changing character of warfare that are particularly important to the Australian Army, and we've listed them again in this section. So the first one is the acceleration of technology into warfare. Now, whether that be autonomy, whether it be drone capabilities, whether it be the insertion of artificial intelligence, those trends, the acceleration of those insertion of those trends into warfare is profound, and it's really important to us. The second is sensor proliferation, the proliferation of camera systems, of satellite systems. People talk about a transparent battlefield. But what we also say in this section is there is a huge opportunity in the clutter in the land domain in our region, in the jungles, in the urban areas, and therefore if sensors proliferate, it's in the clutter that the opportunity exists for the Army. The third is the exponential growth in weapon ranges, lethality and speed. So we agree that weapon ranges are growing, they are becoming more lethal, and the ability to target them quickly, the sensor to shoot a link, is compressing. Now that's not just missiles, that's every system. So the ability to fire a rifle has extended from 100 meters to 300 meters to 600 meters to 800 meters. So we live in a time where weapon ranges, lethality and speed are all growing in lethality, and therefore we have to have the capacity to operate and survive inside that environment. The fourth is mass urbanisation in the littoral. That's not necessarily really a change in character point, but urbanisation in the littoral characterises our region. So our battlefield is not just littoral, it's highly likely to be urban. The fifth is the tyranny of distance. We have to fight against this tyranny of distance in our region. It's more than 3,500 kilometres from Adelaide to Darwin, down one major route, and then that extends further north into the archipelago to our north. And then finally, we live in a region of armies, and you can actually say we live in a region of mass armies. So while we remain an army that is modest in size, our allies and partners to our north, the size of the armies and the role they play in society is hugely important. And the strategic land power network that is being constructed around the region as part of a deterrent approach is intensely powerful. And then the final section of the Army contribution to the National Defence Strategy 24 is all about our history. So we tend to look at ourselves through a lens of 3 things. We look at ourselves through the lens of Gallipoli, we look at ourselves through the lens of the Second World War, and we look at ourselves through the lens of the global war on terror, really since the turn of the century. What we think now is that as part of becoming a focused force, we need to focus our study of our history onto one specific part of that, and that's really the Pacific warfare campaigns from 1942 to 1945. So in this very simple 2-page spread, we've tried to pull out just what we think are a couple of good examples. So that if units are doing PME, if they're trying to think about how they're going to shape their operating environment, if they want to go and learn lessons from history, this is a really good place to start, to place ourselves back into the warfighting environment of the Pacific from 42 to 45, and really understand the practical challenges, healthcare and survival, operating in jungle conditions, the use of engineers, the logistics challenges that exist within it. None of those have really fundamentally changed. And on August the 15th, literally in a couple of weeks' time, we'll hit the 80th anniversary of the end of the Pacific campaigns. So it's a perfect time to sit down and reflect on what we might learn from that campaign. And that really draws the document to an end. So again, try to keep it pretty simple. It's no more than 30 pages, but it tries to carry through the transformation of Army right from the broadest principles of us in 3 dimensions, the national institution, the profession, and the fighting force, right down through our history to where we're going to fight. But that really aligns together all of that transformative effort that you see through things like Talisman Sabre. So just in closing, all right, where did we start? We started with the idea that we face significant challenges, that Australia faces the most complex and challenging strategic environment since the Second World War, and we need to respond to that, all right? The response is these contributions to the National Defence Strategy, but what I want to express to you is that this isn't a brand new thing, it's not something we've just started. It's built on the work of various strategic documents, of various ideas and concept development that stretches back for 2019 and beyond. So we can trace Army's transformation back, the thinking that's underpinned it all the way through. And what I say is that actually what we're doing now isn't necessarily new, we're just accelerating the delivery of it significantly to meet much more challenging circumstances than we expressed. So my final message to you is about focus. We talk about being a focused force. So really what we're trying to express now, and what the Chief expresses everywhere he goes, is the Australian Army has 3 things. We have one vision, okay, and that vision is captured in the Army contribution to the National Defence Strategy. We have one plan, which is the Army plan developed by Army Headquarters, and we have one order, which is the Army order, which is delivered every year. And if we can align behind those 3 things, we'll achieve the delivery we need. By doing that, we really engage 2 vital principles of war. And they're a really good thing to go back to, the principles of war. But if we can get this right, we're applying the selection and maintenance of the aim, and we're applying simplicity to the challenges we face. So hey, look, I hope that's been helpful. Thank you very much for your attention. And I'll open up for any questions and discussions from the audience.
Thanks very much, sir. They say when you explain something really well, people don't have any questions. So far, we haven't had any questions from the online audience, so you must have explained it perfectly. So last chance for anyone to get any questions in. But in the meantime, I'd like to thank you for taking this time out of your busy schedule to appear on the Cove and explain this very, very pertinent and very, very important topic in our capstone document to all Army members. So it's been great having you on the Cove, sir.
Hey, thank you very much indeed. And look, to anyone out there who had a question they didn't want to ask on the Cove, please do drop me a line. I'm available on email. I'm very happy to answer your questions. But good luck and good soldiering.
Great.
Thank you.
And with that, thanks, sir.
Thanks very much indeed, Andrew.
Thank you.
Have a nice afternoon.
Cheers.
Thank you.